Dear Levi, June 7th, 1854, page 54. Dear Levi, it's been 2 days since I last wrote, and so much has happened, I don't know where to begin. I suppose I should start with the worst. Frank has gone. He's run away. I think he's hoping to hide out and then go west with the train behind us. Just the other day, he was telling me how lucky I was to have a family as nice as the Morrisons to take me in. I never thought then that he'd be looking for another family himself. It seems his pa gave him another whipping last night. When I woke up this morning, I found his snakeskin in my pack, and Hiram found his fossil rock outside his wagon. I had a sick feeling in my stomach when I saw that skin, 'cause I knew how much it meant to Frank, and I knew how bad he must have felt having to run away in these desolate parts. Hiram and I spent a good part of the morning looking for him and calling his name, but if he heard us, he never answered. It was decided at supper that a group of men would go out searching at first light tomorrow, but Mr. Hart warned that we couldn't afford to stop longer than a few hours as our supplies were running low. Mr. Morrison has volunteered to go along with Hiram and Pa and a few others. Mr. Hickman looks as miserable as ever, and it's hard to tell if he misses Frank or not. Hiram and I surely do. Sometimes I lie awake a long time listening to the coyotes howling, and I think about Oregon and wonder if the land's really as beautiful as Pa said in his letters. There's been as many graves along this trail that I'm grateful he made it out to Oregon. I'd hate to think of him left out here with nothing but dust and the wolves. I hope Frank has found a good hiding place. Your brother, Austin. June 10th, 1851. Dear Levi, a most terrible thing has happened. About an hour after Mr. Morrison and the others went out searching for Frank, who should come limping into camp but Frank himself. It seems he was only a few yards away all the while, hiding in some tall grass. His foot never healed proper, and when the pain started up again, he decided to come back. We were all much relieved, and Mr. Hart sent a man out to call in the search party. Hiram and I were playing with Charlotte and Lucy when we heard the shots. It wasn't long before Mr. Hickman and the others came riding back into camp. Mr. Morrison was not with them. Then Hiram's pa walked up to Mrs. Morrison and bowed his head. When he looked up and I saw his eyes, I knew what he was going to say. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Morrison, but Tom's dead," he said. "He's been shot by Indians. We couldn't get to him. We barely got out with our lives." I couldn't watch any more because my eyes were filling up with tears. Then Hiram came up and stood beside me, but it was as if he were 100 miles away. It was the strangest feeling, as if I were all alone and no one could reach me. It was just the way I felt when Pa died. Mr. Hart has called for everyone to arm themselves, and he's sent a messenger to the fort. Mrs. Morrison is beside herself with grief, and I've had to look after the girls who are as heartsick as their mother. I cannot understand how someone as good and kind as Mr. Morrison was killed because of Mr. Hickman's wrongdoing. Why didn't they kill Mr. Hickman? I can't help feeling that he was the one who should have died, for he was the one that fired the gun and murdered that Indian woman, and he was the one that drove his own son away. Mr. Hickman started right in again on Frank for having run away, and he tried to say that Mr. Morrison's death was on account of Frank, but Mr. Hart stepped in and said that the Indians most likely hadn't forgotten about their squaw and would have attacked anyway for revenge. But likely as that may be, Frank's sure to get the switch. Poor Mr. Morrison was the kindest, most gentle man I have ever met, and it seems such a bitter mistake that he should have to die. I'm trying hard to school in my sadness, but it's not easy. Mr. Morrison was so like a pa to me. He taught me to swim and to mend an axle, and he was planning on showing me how to farm. It's hard now to think of Oregon without him. All those plans he had for us, for the orchard and the chickens. As I tucked Charlotte into her bed tonight, she asked me if her pa could hear her in heaven. I told her I supposed he could, and she said she was glad because now she would talk to him every night so he wouldn't be lonely. As I write to you, I can hear Mrs. Morrison's low sobs and little Charlotte whispering softly about peach trees, and I feel as if all the sadness in the world has settled in this wagon tonight. Your grieved brother, Austin. Dear Levi, pages 59 through 64. Dear Levi, the militia arrived today, and they were a sight. They seemed very courageous in their fine blue uniforms, and the officers had sabers that glistened in the sunlight. The general rode right into our camp, and he and Mr. Hart had a long talk. Hiram and I fetched water for his horse. Hiram even cut a piece of the horse's tail for a keepsake. He said he never got so close to a horse belonging to a general in the U.S. Army. There are hundreds of soldiers on horseback. Their uniforms seem very fine. Everyone feels much relieved with them here, especially since we've learned that there is a large Sioux village close by. The only one not happy about the situation is Reuben. He says the Indians have taken one of ours for one of theirs, and the way they see it, justice has been served. But the army doesn't see it that way. They don't count an Indian's life worth as much as a white man's. Reuben says they can be more savage than the Indians. Mrs. Morrison asked me if I thought I could stay on with her and help her get to Oregon now that Mr. Morrison is gone. Mr. Buckner, Hiram's pa, has offered to help when he can, and Mr. Yardley came by and checked all of our wheels for us. I know it will be a struggle once we start moving again, but I cannot let Mrs. Morrison and the girls down. I am the man of the wagon now. After supper, Mrs. Morrison took me aside and handed me a bundle tied in strings. "These are all Tom's maps," she whispered. "I know that he would have wanted you to have them." I didn't open them up, but kept them tied in the string. Later that night, I took them to bed with me. Your brother, Austin. Dear Levi, it has been 2 days, and we've just received word from the militia that we can continue on. There will be no threat of Indian attack as the army has gone into the Sioux village and killed them all. We could hear the gunfire from here. The estimate was 400 Indians dead and 2 soldiers killed. Some people in camp are calling it a victory. I don't see it that way, and neither does Reuben. A victory is when something has been won, he said. What has been won here? 400 lives have been taken, and because they are not white-skinned people, because they have different dress and ways, we celebrate their deaths. But had they been white, what would we have called it then? Victory? No, a slaughter. As I stood there with Reuben in his button-covered coat, I suddenly realized how differently he looks at things. Most people stick to their own kind, but maybe because Reuben is alone in the world, he feels no special kinship to any one kind of people. He feels a kinship to all people. I wonder that so many on our train feel cause to celebrate. I think about that Indian baby now, and I feel ashamed. Your brother, Austin. Dear Levi, it must be about 100 degrees in the shade. If there was any shade, and I can guarantee you there is not. We crossed Devil's Crater today, a most desolate and rough piece of ground that was ever made. There is not a drop of water or a spear of grass, nothing but cracked, dry prairie rock and dust. Without Mr. Morrison, it is very hard on me, as I do most of the driving, taking turns on and off with Mrs. Morrison. The sand is ankle deep, and it is very slow going. Hiram was walking beside me yesterday when suddenly we heard a loud rattling sound. I looked down to see the biggest rattlesnake I had ever laid eyes on. It was much bigger than the one we saw last spring by Cutler's Creek, and it was inches from Hiram's foot. We both knew that if either of us moved, the snake would attack, so we stood stock still, hoping someone would see us. It was so close that we were afraid to call out. Reuben had made up a supper for us since Mrs. Morrison was feeling poorly, and as he walked toward us, the snake stretched and rattled some more. It didn't take Reuben more than a second to reach for his revolver, and with one shot that snake was laid down. We counted 13 rattles. When we opened the snake up, we found 2 prairie dog pups and an owl egg in its stomach. Hiram and I couldn't decide on who should get the skin. He said he should since it was closest to his foot. We finally decided to take turns keeping it, and he's got it hanging off his belt hook right now. Frank came by and told me he heard Hiram bragging to the Yardley boys that he wrestled the snake to the ground with his bare hands before Reuben finally shot it. I'm surprised he gave Reuben any credit at all. Mrs. Morrison is looking very worn out as the baby she's been expecting is due any time now. If the baby is a boy, she plans to name him Thomas Austin. I felt happy and sad on hearing this. Your brother, Austin. Dear Austin, pages 65 through 73. Dear Levi, pages 65 through 73. Dear Levi, we passed Independence Rock this morning, and there looked to be 1,000,000 names carved on it. At noon, we came to Devil's Gate. I have never seen such a wonder in my life. The Sweetwater River passes through a gap or gate, as it's called, of the Rocky Mountains. It passes right through the mountain of solid rock, about 2 rods wide. The rocks are more than 200 feet high, and even the tallest man seems very small standing next to them. We crossed Sweetwater River on a bridge, which I was most grateful for. Mrs. Morrison had to pay $3. The stock had to be swum across, but the current was so swift the horses kept turning back. There were Snake Indians on the shore who were offering to swim the animals across and trade for corn, coffee, or whiskey. These were the first Indians we've come upon since Fort Laramie, and everyone was nervous. Reuben spoke to them and told us that they were friendly. He was the first to trade to have his mule swum across. After that, most of the rest of us followed, excepting Mr. Hickman, who almost drowned when his oxen turned midstream. The water here is alkali and poison. One of Mr. Belshaw's horses died after drinking some. I had a hard time keeping our stock away from it. There are many copperheads here. Your brother, Austin. Dear Levi, we saw our first buffalo today. I had stopped to fix a harness when I heard what I thought to be a thunderstorm. I looked to the west and saw a great moving black cloud in the distance. As it came closer, I saw that indeed it was a herd of buffalo, their noses to the ground and their tails flying midair. Something had stirred them, for they were stampeding, and it was easy to tell that anything in their path was sure to be mowed down. A couple of Mr. Hart's men took off on horses and brought two of the beasts down. Reuben was not very pleased. He told me that the buffalo is a walking storehouse, what with the meat from the hump and tongue and marrow bone. Then there's the skin and fur for covering and the chips for fuel. He said that since we had neither the proper utensils to make use of the massive beast, nor the time to spare for such preparations, it was sinful to let so much go to waste. But as he prepared what meat he could, the humps and tongues, Reuben said it should prove especially tender and flavorful because it came from cows, not bulls. He said the men were lucky to bring down the buffalo cow since they can outrun the bulls. After the stampede, we collected buffalo chips and used them to make a fire. Reuben stripped the hind legs of flesh and buried them in the coals of the chips. In an hour, baked marrow was served. It was the most delicious thing I've ever tasted on this trip. Reuben and some of the women hung strips of meat outside the wagon to cure for jerky. Mrs. Morrison was worried about wolves smelling the meat and coming around at night, so she wouldn't have any. She seems to be more anxious and fearful with each passing day. I'm teaching Charlotte to milk the cows, and she has even helped me to yoke the cattle. Your brother, Austin. Dear Levi, Reuben says that we should reach the shores of the Columbia in little more than 4 weeks' time. Traveled 23 miles to the Snake River today through Pawnee country. We did not see any Pawnee, and Reuben says that's a good thing. He says the Indians are no different from white men in that they are good and bad in both races. He said that the Pawnee are at war with the Sioux, who are peaceful and look to be left alone. Reuben says that if the U.S. Army had only known more about the situation in Nebraska and how peaceful the Sioux are, they could have spared that village. We crossed Swamp Creek this morning and Goose Creek this afternoon. The banks along Goose Creek go almost straight up and then straight down. A number of things pitched out of the wagon, including Lucy. She was shaken up, but not hurt bad. The prairie stretches out as far as my eye can see, with nothing growing on it but a brown grass and a greenish-gray sagebrush. When we first came upon it, the sage was pleasant to smell, but after walking through miles and miles of the stuff, I soon grew weary of its scent. When the wind blows, the grass rolls back and forth like so many waves of water. Reuben says it reminds him of the sea. Never having seen an ocean, I couldn't rightly say, though looking at all that swaying grass gave Mrs. Morrison a bout of dizziness. Reuben offered a tonic of herbs he said was especially helpful for seasickness. There is no good water to be found except in some mud puddles by the side of the road or the green slimy water standing at the bottom of the ravines. Frank and I were so thirsty this afternoon that we shut our eyes and took a drink from the mud puddle. When I think of the puddles I used to jump in and over back home, I can hardly believe that I'm now drinking from them. Your thirsty brother, Austin. Dear Levi, we have not come very far in the last few days, as the road is rocky, and we seem to spend all of our time pushing, pulling, and dragging our wagons along. To dampen our spirits even further, we must pass by the evidence of those who have failed before us, for the road is littered with broken wheels, axles, and whole wagons that have been left behind. Sometimes I am astonished that we have come this far at all. I often daydream of Pennsylvania and its soft rolling hills, good roads, and sturdy houses. I've been thinking a lot about houses of late, and how much I'd like to sleep in one, on a good bed with clean sheets and a real feather pillow. All this talk of beds has got me shutting my eyes, so I will say good night. Your brother, Austin. Dear Levi, pages 74 through 83. Dear Levi, we are camped in a strange place full of bubbling springs. We learned that the springs are called soda springs or steamboat springs, and I can certainly see why. The hot water bubbles right up out of the ground. Hiram's mother made a cup of tea by just scooping up some water and pouring it over the tea leaves. It is great fun to throw sticks and stones into these jets and watch them rise almost 3 feet. Near one spring there is an air hole that makes the sound of a steamboat, but not loud. When I tried some of the water, it was hot and I had to spit it out. It was so unpleasant, like soda water without any syrup, only a metal taste. The women are determined that we all have a bath, but it was hard to find a spring with water cool enough to bathe in. We finally did, but it was still very hot. Your brother Austin. Dear Levi, we are traveling along the Snake River. Hiram caught a horned toad today, and it was truly amazing. The Yardley boys offered to trade their marbles for it, and Toby Nelligan offered his hoop, but Hiram says he won't take any such trifles. When he brought it to show Reuben and me, Reuben warned him that toads cause warts, and Hiram instantly let go of his hold on the thing. We had a hard time finding him after that, for he had hopped into Reuben's wagon. After looking all over, where do you suppose the toad got to? We found him sitting as still as a statue on old Bill's back. If the two of them didn't make a sight. Hiram went to lay a hand on him, and he jumped right out of the wagon and vanished before we could jump out ourselves. The mosquitoes woke us this morning, and we yoked up at first light to drive on and be rid of them. I feel sorriest for the animals, for they can do little to shake them off. Our big ox, Big Abe, is covered with bites and have swelled to the size of a fist. Reuben has rubbed them down with one of his concoctions, and it seems to help. I guess I was looking as sorry as Abe, with all my bites, so Reuben fixed up a bad-smelling concoction of roots and herbs for me, too. When I admired a dried gourd he had hanging in his wagon, he untied it and gave it to me. It is long and twisty, and when you shake it, it sounds like a rattler. It is just curled enough that I can slip it through my belt hook. Reuben says that you can keep away many harmful insects with shaking it, as they don't take to the sound. Mrs. Morrison looks very sad to me. I know she is concerned about the new baby, and I hope we reach the settlement soon. For myself, I will be glad to sleep under a solid roof again, drink some good clean cold water, and see some shady green trees. I think about you and wonder how you're getting on and if you've sprouted up as much as since I left. You would hardly recognize me, as I'm taller by an inch at least, and my skin is darker than a walnut's, though it's hard to tell through the layer of dust that have piled up on me. Your brother Austin. Dear Levi, we have reached Fort Boise, and it is not what I expected. There were 3 new buildings filled with soldiers, Hudson's Bay Company officials, some Frenchmen, and some Indians. It didn't look like much of a fort at all, but one of the soldiers explained that it would be some day. He walked about with Reuben and me, showing us where the stockade was underway and where the other buildings would eventually go. He said it will be a stronghold to reckon with one day. I would have liked to stay longer, but everyone is anxious to move on, seeing how we are close to reaching the shores of the Columbia. We are losing cattle every day. The road is dry and dusty, and there seems to be no end to the dead horses, oxen, mules, and cows that line the road. Along with these are yokes, chains, buggies, and even wagons that have been left. Everyone feels uneasy having to walk by such sights. One of our calves took sick and died yesterday morning, and a good milk cow died this afternoon. Mr. Hart said that it was due to the bad water or weeds. The Buckman's ox, old Dave, just dropped dead in the yoke. The smell from the dead cattle is very bad, and we've decided to push on further to get away from it. Reuben says the wolves will be feasting tonight. The other evening we saw a herd of about 50 of them, and they began howling and didn't let up until sunrise. Added to this was the hooting of owls. You never heard such a racket. Mrs. Morrison is very frightened to hear the wolves, and I have to admit it was a fearsome sound. Reuben knows a lot about wolves and their ways. He says there are many different kinds of them on the prairie. There is the common gray prairie wolf, the black wolf, and another, a large, long-legged wolf. This long-legged one is called a buffalo ranger, as it stalks the buffalo, often bringing down a calf. These wolves are most ferocious and will attack a man if hungry. After supper last night, Reuben got out his Jew's harp, and Mr. Buckner took out his fiddle. Some folks got up to dance, and Charlotte pulled on my arm until I thought it would fall off, so I got up to dance with her and didn't know the steps. Mrs. Yardley offered to give us a lesson, and by the last tune we were almost getting it right. Frank and Hiram had a good laugh to my expense, but it was worth it to see Mrs. Morrison smiling again. I wonder what the wolves thought about our carrying on. Hope you are well, your brother, Austin. Dear Levi, it is hard to believe how many miles we've come, and yet we still have a ways to go before we reach the Columbia River. Hiram, Frank, and I were following a trail not far from the road, collecting lava stones, when we spotted a grizzly. It must have been 800 pounds or more, and at least 8 feet tall standing. Its paws were as big as both my hands together. Luckily, we were far enough away and downwind so it did not pick up our scent. Frank's pa told us never to shoot at a grizzly alone, because when fired at, they start immediately for the place where the gun cracked. Yet one ball rightly put in will kill them as easily as a buffalo. Frank had his rifle, I had my bowie knife, and all Hiram had was his slingshot, but Frank's hands were trembling so bad we didn't think to risk it. We just stayed put and watched as the great bear turned and wandered off over a hill. We would certainly have been heroes if we had returned to camp with such a prize as a grizzly, but I was glad just to be able to see it. I think it would have been a sad deed to put down such a great beast. He looked as if he was going to attack us, wouldn't you say? Hiram said on the way back to camp. And he was at least 10, maybe 12 feet tall, wouldn't you say? By the time we reached the wagons, Hiram had so embroidered on the truth that Frank and I breathed a sigh of relief. Walking across this country offers a boy more excitement than he could ever find at home. The truth is that every now and then I long for those quiet times when you and I sat out on Miss Amelia's back porch with a bowl of her vanilla bean ice cream and the smell of peach pie drifting out of the kitchen. Pennsylvania sure seems a long way away. Your brother, Austin. Dear Levi, pages 84 through 93. Dear Levi, we've come some 20 miles since last I wrote you. The country here is rough and the road very rocky, but we found some good grass for grazing the cattle, who were looking thin and worn out. There is also good water here from the mountain streams. There are steep mountains with snow on the peaks. The nights are bitter cold, and yet by noontime the sun is sizzling hot. We had to stop yesterday, for the Mendelssohn's wagon broke down, with the tongue needing repairs, and the Yardley's axle was ready to give out. While we waited, Frank and I climbed up the ledge and got a bucket of snow water to drink. When Hiram came looking for us, we surprised him with an attack of snowballs. Coming down, I picked a handful of blue and yellow flowers for Mrs. Morrison, as I know blue is her favorite color. Frank found the horns of a mountain goat and was glad to have them. When we got back to camp, Reuben made a pot of sage hen soup and offered some to us, as Mrs. Morrison was feeling poorly again. He also brought us some broiled prairie dog, which Mrs. Morrison refused to eat. I tasted a bit, and it seemed very much like turkey to me, though I could not persuade Mrs. Morrison to try any. Last night the rocks lit up with the glow of our fires, and you could smell the pine trees very strongly. As hard as this road is to travel, it is sometimes a beautiful place. Your brother, Austin. Dear Levi, it grieves me to have to write you that Mrs. Morrison has died. She took to her bed inside the wagon just 2 days ago. Mrs. Yardley attended to her, as did Mrs. Taylor, but they could not save her or the new baby boy that was born. We had been traveling high over a mountain, and the road was especially rocky and difficult. I can't help but think the two would have lived had we made it to the settlement. It is pitiful to hear Lucy and Charlotte's cries for their mother, and even Mattie seems inconsolable. As I watched them wrap Mrs. Morrison and the new baby together in a quilt to be buried, I felt as if the cold wind was blowing through my heart. Mr. Buckner had made a headstone from a wagon wheel found along the road. Later, Mr. Yardley and a group of others came by to talk to me. It was decided that the wagon would be taken apart, since there was no use hauling it any farther. I know Mrs. Morrison would have wanted the girls to remain together, but there is no one here who can afford to take on 3 extra children. Mrs. Buckner has offered to take in Charlotte and Lucy, and Mrs. Yardley, who lost her own little girl, will take Mattie. They will divide up the cattle. Most of Mrs. Morrison's things will have to be left behind. That left only me to decide about. I suppose I must go back to my first plan and look for work in the lumber camp once we reach the Columbia River. But we still have a way to go, and I needed to travel with someone. Everyone got real quiet. And then Mr. Hookman stepped up and said he supposed he could use an extra hand. Frank's eyes grew bigger than silver dollars at this suggestion, and I felt my stomach sink at the thought of having to live under that cruel man's eye. But I didn't see any other way until Reuben came walking around the wagon. "Oh, no, you don't," he said. "I've been looking for a good pot scrubber for a long time, and besides, Austin here and I are already friends. What do you say to coming along with me and old Bill, boy?" I looked down at the moon-faced button on my coat, and I felt myself starting to grin. So it's all settled. I'm to travel the rest of the way with old Bill and Reuben McAllister Rice. Reuben and I sat for a long while and talked about getting on in the world. Reuben says you can never know what will befall you, and it wasn't hard for me to agree. He says the most important thing he learned is that you must always be prepared to bend with whichever way the breeze is blowing, or like a brittle tree you'll snap. I said I felt that I did much more bending. If I did much more bending, I'd have a hard time ever straightening up again. I couldn't get to sleep for thinking about Mrs. Morrison in her rocking chair and how I couldn't bear to just leave it on the side of the road. So the next morning Frank and I got up early and carried it to a little grove where there were some blue flowers growing, and we set it there. Later on, as the wagon started to roll and we began heading out, we passed the wooden marker with Emily Morrison and her baby son Thomas Austin Morrison carved on it. I turned my face away, feeling too sad for words, and it was then that I spied her chair in the distance where Frank and I had placed it. It was the saddest sight I ever saw, for the wind had picked up, and that empty chair had begun to rock all by itself in that field of pretty blue flowers. Your brother, Austin. Dear Levi, we are waiting our turn to cross the Snake River, after which we'll follow the trail through the Blue Mountains. There is one small ferry boat that will take the wagons across. It is owned by Hudson's Bay's company. This is a large river and is very hard getting the stock over. There are Indians who do nothing but swim the river from morning till night. Reuben thinks they are all the Rogue River tribe. After all the stock lost, everyone is grateful to pay the Indians to do this. Even Mr. Hickman is paid to have his cattle crossed. Reuben has only one ox to care for and two mules, so I reckon I'll have an easier time, though he wasn't fooling about the pot scrubbing. He cooks for 8 men, and that makes for a mess of pots as well as plates. But working with Reuben is truly fun, for he's always whistling and working alongside me, telling funny stories and making me laugh. Hiram, being a small boy, has been having some problems with bigger boys picking on him. There are 2 bullies who seem intent on tormenting him. These are the Judson brothers, Zeb and Stuart. They are built like mountains with great big bodies and very little brains, and they've taken to shoving Hiram and knocking him down. They haven't the courage to harm him when Frank or I are about. I feel sorry for Hiram, as I must always be on the lookout, and he carries his slingshot wherever he goes now. The 3 of us has decided to stay together as much as we can. Yesterday we found a beaver's dam as we neared the river. It was made from the willows that line the banks. The branches were cut so clean and smooth you'd swear it had to be the work of a hatchet. The whole construction was layered with sticks neatly laid. Above this they had thrown moss and leaves, which, catching the sand, had completely stopped the water and raised it 3 feet. The dam was some 40 feet long. Reuben told me that the Indians believed the beaver had a great soul, and on seeing such work as this dam, I believe it. After having a good look, we decided to hide in some brush so as to catch sight of the beavers. We spent a long while waiting, and every now and then I'd give the gourd Reuben gave me a shake to keep away the buffalo gnats that were attacking us. To pass the time, Hiram showed us his crooked toe, Frank showed his 2 warts, and I showed off the long scar I got from slipping on the rock last year. When we heard a splash, we all looked up to see a beaver going about his work. This was the first beaver I had ever laid my eyes on, and he looked very much like a muskrat to me, except that he was larger, with a big broad tail that was flat, hard, and scaly like a fish. His teeth were like squirrels, only much larger. He seemed very strong indeed. We were having great fun watching him build his dam, when suddenly we saw a rock come flying straight for him. The beaver was quick to dive under the water, and when we looked to see where the rock had come from, who should come out of the brush but Zeb Judson and his brother Stuart. The bullies swaggered over to the beaver's dam and proceeded to tear into it. We were outraged, as we had seen how hard our beaver had worked, and by now we did think of him as our beaver. Hiram raised his slingshot and muttered something about protecting the dam. He seemed willing to risk all for the sake of the beavers until I persuaded him to put his slingshot down. Then I had an idea, which I promptly whispered to my comrades. Within minutes, Frank jumped out of the brush and screamed, "Snakes! Snakes! Rattlesnakes!" Hiram jumped out yelling, "It's a whole mess of 'em! Run for your lives!" I waited a few seconds for the Judson boys to look up, and then, as I lay out of sight, I began shaking the gourd as hard as I could. At the sound of those seeds rattling around in the gourd, the two bullies lit out of there faster than a jackrabbit. Back at camp, we found them huffing and puffing and telling everyone who would listen about the nest of rattlesnakes they almost stepped on. Then, what does Hiram do but puff out his chest and walk right up to Zeb, the biggest, and say loudly so everyone can hear, "Gee, boys, you sure can run fast when you're scared." The Judsons gave him a queer look back. Then Hiram turned to me and gave the gourd on my belt a shake. "Never saw anybody run so fast at the sound of a few seeds shaking." This set everyone to laughing, everyone except the Judsons, of course. They looked mad enough to foam at the mouth. Hiram may be small, but he's got the spunk of someone twice his size. Later in the day, Reuben asked us to hunt him up some sweet black mice for a pie. We were lucky enough to run into a nest of them along the river bank, and he was much pleased with our catch. I had a harder time tasting the mice pie than I did the prairie dogs, and finally could not bring myself to eat any, though Reuben claimed it was very delicious. Your brother, Austin.